Welcome to Capital Gains, Yahoo Finance's unique look at how US government policy will affect your bottom line long after the presidential election polls have closed. And of course, this week it's all about what the Fed said, or rather what it did, cutting interest rates with that jumbo cut of 50 basis points. So we're going to be taking a look at what that means for the path forward in the fight against inflation, first rate cut we've had since 2020, and what does this mean for the future of the economy and how the campaigns are going to be handling it. We're going to be diving into that, as well as taking a look at foreign policy. For that, we'll also be joined by four-star General Wesley Clark, who's the chairman of investment firm Invera, and Yahoo News' correspondent Andrew Romano will also be getting us up to speed on all the polling action to see how all of these headlines have been influencing voters this week. But first, let's introduce my co-stars, Ben Wershkul and Rick Newman, as we break this all down and see what they've been watching this week. So, Ben, what have you got for us?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, it's Fed week. So I have three topics here: Fed, Fed, and Fed. So you mentioned the move this week. A quick little summary of the political reaction to kind of get us going. Donald Trump, as expected, he was critical of it. He was critical of it in a different way that I think will be interesting to talk about. His quote was that it shows the economy is very bad. He for most of this year, he was talking about how Jerome Powell is political, even though he appointed Jerome Powell, and was working to help the Democrats. Now it's sort of this rate cut is indication that the Commonomics economy isn't working. So it's kind of a shift from him. He still talks about playing politics, but it's a kind of a milder version of what we've seen here. Probably Powell is happy about. He's also getting critiqued from the very left, even though he made this 50 basis point move. Elizabeth Warren still isn't happy. He's probably Jerome Powell. He would never say this, but he's probably fine with that. That she wants more. She responded by saying he should have cut sooner, but she's sort of happy with where things are. And then Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are kind of in the middle. Kamala Harris said this is good news, but she tried to focus on her agenda. And then Biden had a speech. He wants to kind of have it celebrate this and talk about the economic progress, but his aides are sort of very insistent this isn't a victory lap. He doesn't want a mission accomplished moment. So it's kind of a diffuse political reaction that's a little different than we might have expected a few months ago.
I couldn't believe the Fed cut by 50 points. I'm still aghast. And the day before I said on Twitter, or whatever it's called now, I said there's no way the Fed is cutting 50 points. The economy only needs 25, and the Fed does not want to look political by cutting so much 2 months before the election. And there they did it. And, there are people other than Trump who are criticizing the Fed for being political. There's a banking analyst named Chris Whalen, well known. We've had him on our show. He says the Fed is getting political. So I don't know if the Fed's getting political or not. But then you have to ask the basic question: does this rate cut do anything to help Kamala Harris? I have no idea, but you are seeing improvements, sort of modest improvements in consumer surveys, because people know that interest rate cuts are coming, or they did before the cut, and now they expect interest rates to be going down, and we have in fact seen mortgage rates going down. So that, if you're Kamala Harris, it certainly doesn't hurt. Does it actually win you any votes? I have no idea, but it's going the direction she wants it to, finally.
It's true. Front loading it with that jumbo cut, was a surprise, more on the aggressive side than I think the Fed was expecting, being that they've said, we're going to watch month to month. But you raise a good point, Rick. When it comes to voters and perhaps waiting for some of the domino effects of these rate cuts to trickle through the economy and the bond market, I'm not sure that's actually going to be a good read through for voters by the time the election comes around. Ben, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's the sort of bottom line. There is a pretty compelling argument that if the Fed wanted to be political, which very few people say are being political, they would have cut sooner. They would have done cuts earlier in the year, which actually would have given it more time to trickle through. So, and Powell, he said this himself in his press conference. He was asked about politics, and he made the point that a lot of this happens on a lag. So I think Rick's right that definitely that the real world effects here aren't going to necessarily be felt by the election. And it's kind of more of a perception question at this point is do we have a win over inflation, and do people to believe that, rather than whether they actually see their mortgage go down in some significant way.
Ben, you wrote about the housing sector and some of these sort of conflating issues between housing and immigration and inflation. Break some of that down for us, because it does seem like all of those things are getting lumped in, and especially when you consider some of that targeted, essentially hatred and backlash that we've seen in Springfield, and Trump saying that he's going to go and visit there. And It's just become sort of all blended in together.
It's, as you mentioned, all these issues, inflation, immigration, and housing especially, all get kind of conflated together. I'll take housing first. Kamala Harris has talked about a plan to increase housing supply, but it's a long-term process. It's a credit that could hopefully work over 4 years. Housing gets caught up in Trump's message. He talked about the Fed in response to that. He also went on to talk about how he's the candidate of low mortgage rates. So it's all kind of a mishmash there with kind of both sides, but especially Trump to a certain extent, kind of promising the whole world on this. And then immigration is even more knotty and complicated. The story you mentioned, I talked about, Jerome Powell actually weighed in on Springfield this summer. It feels like 100 years ago, but it was in July, right before J.D. Vance got picked. And it was none other than Senator J.D. Vance who asked him about it. And they talked about Springfield, and it was about housing, and it was about immigration, and it was about all these issues coming together in a little bit more of an insightful way. I think that world is gone for at least the time being, at least until after November. But there's a link between immigration and inflation. It's not, Powell says it's not as strong as you think. Republicans like J.D. Vance kind of have tried to make a case that it's more there, but it's caught up in cat eating at the moment.
Can I just say something? Leave Springfield alone! Springfield doesn't want Trump talking about, doesn't want Vance. We had the Republican governor of Ohio saying, get out of here. I mean, what is this? And then Trump says, the first thing he's going to do if he gets elected is he's going to aim his deportation effort at Springfield, Ohio. Leave these people alone. All right, never mind.
Yeah, these are like real issues that this town is coming with. They're less kind of exciting than this, but it's getting driver's license for these Haitian immigrants who, by the way, are here legally. Trump says they're illegal and he'll deport them. They're not. They're here legally under temporary protected workers. There's these issues of getting them health care and all these questions, which are more important but less kind of tied to the campaign at the moment.
So let's just remember, most of these people, these Haitian immigrants, are working. There are companies in Springfield that need workers. When you have a growing labor force, that means you have companies that are employing those people, and that's the way a dynamic economy works. Trump wants to take all the workers out of Springfield, or a bunch of them, just because they're Haitian migrants. And then what are those companies? But what are you going to do? Are you then going to bus in some, white Americans to do those jobs? What's the plan other than picking on the Haitian immigrants?
And Rick, you raise a good point. And this is obviously Trump said he was going to be the champion of Haitians when they were first coming here. So it's sad to see how this is playing out. You don't want anyone to be scapegoated in an election like this. But this is a very controversial election that we're in. We will have to leave it there, though, because we do have more coming up after the break. Welcome back to Capital Gains. We're now joined by retired General Wesley Clark to discuss his thoughts around the election and the potential impact over foreign and economic policy. General Clark is the former Supreme Allied Commander for Europe and NATO and is chairman and CEO of his own firm as well at Envera. Thank you so much for joining us. So a lot of people, they're looking at some of the foreign policy that's been laid out so far by both the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign. What do you think is going to be the top priority in terms of foreign policy that has the biggest potential impact on the U.S. economy?
Well, I think the biggest impact is going to be actually what happens in the Middle East, because I think it could really change the election if Iran were to test a nuclear weapon before the election. I think it would have big repercussions. Now, how that would affect individual businesses, I think you'll see a immediate spike in the price of oil if that happens, and a lot of recalculations of investment decisions and things like this. So I think that's my biggest concern. Second would be Ukraine, but I think Ukraine is relatively solid right now. I'm very impressed with the Ukraine military and how they have moved into the Kursk area. They show they've learned a lot of lessons from the mistakes of the summer of 2023. It was a real effective combined arms operation. It's still ongoing. They've got to hold the Russians back at Pokrovsk. That seems to be working, although it's very difficult. So I'm relatively optimistic in the near term on Ukraine, but honestly, we've got to do more to help them. They need a strong policy that says they're going to be given what they need to take their terrain back, their territory back, and really that's what's missing right now. If we get that, I think Ukraine will move forward, and Europe will be strengthened. I think all of the economic aspects of that will be positive.
Hey, General, thanks for joining us. Follow-up question on the Middle East for you. I'm about a story that I think is really compelling this week about these exploding pagers in Lebanon. The reports are that about Hezbollah operatives seemingly at the after an Israeli mission have done this. I'm curious, kind of your response, your thoughts on it overall, what it means for the region, but also what it means for our kind of relationship with technology and for technology companies. I can tell you every time I've put my phone in my pocket the last week, I've thought about this story.
Well, I think it means that for the region that this is Israeli, this is special operations, and this is probably the prelude to a much stronger effort to dissuade or even run Hezbollah out of South Lebanon. Bibi Netanyahu's promised the Israeli settlers and people who live in the north, go back to your homes. You can't do that if Hezbollah is unaffected. Now, I think, honestly, the casualty figures really they underestimate the impact, because if a pager beeps and you're only injured, yeah, but you may have had your hand blown off or something like this. So I think it's a very significant blow to Hezbollah. I notice it's being followed up by Israeli strikes today, and we don't know where this is going to end. But I think it is just another effort by the Israelis to leap ahead, to find a way to go after their enemy in an unconventional manner, and they've done so.
General Clark, I'm trying to run dates together in my mind, so I think your tenure as the military boss at NATO, I think that overlapped with Vladimir Putin's first years as Russian president. What should the United States and Europe be doing about Vladimir Putin, medium term and longer term? Is the Biden administration strategy more or less the most we can do, or are there other ways to contain Vladimir Putin?
I think the best means of containing Vladimir Putin is really to show that his invasion of Ukraine has failed. And to do that, Ukraine has to regain its territory. So there's a lot of ancillary efforts that Putin's making. He flies aircraft toward Alaska. He uses disinformation. He's going after with sabotage, maybe some undersea cables. Occasionally people are getting assassinated. It is a general threatening effort. But let's look at what's right on the table in front of us, and that's Ukraine. He violated the sort of sacred norms of the international community. He actually invaded another country with massive force. That can't be tolerated in the 21st century. So if we want to handle Vladimir Putin, it's not a matter of secret stuff behind the scenes and talk and everything. It's a matter of telling the Ukrainians, we're going to give you what you need, take your territory back.
Well, is this strategy doing that, or do you think we should be doing more?
No, we're not. We're not doing that. The administration doesn't really have a strategy like this. They have policy guidelines, and the policy like bumpers. On one side, they don't want Ukraine to lose, and on the other side, they don't want to provoke Putin. And in between, they have to consider each weapon system individually and what the impact is going to be. And that's the way it's been approached. But it's time to move past that. We've looked at the red lines. We've seen this. Time is not necessarily on Ukraine's side. If you look at the West, 30 nations in NATO, there's an election every 3 or 4 months. Their governments are always changing. New people are coming in. And that's also true in the United States. You get a rollover of people. So Ukraine is putting 100% of its effort into its self-defense. People there I just came back from Ukraine. There's not an ounce of quit there in terms of the military and the civilians and the government. But they do need more support, and especially from the United States. We have what they need. But it's not just longer range ATACMS. They need the whole panoply of equipment they need. They need to lay out a plan to take back their terrain, and we need to look at it, and if it makes sense, we need to resource it.
So then, General, as we're looking at the longer term strategy, based on what you've been hearing out of the Harris camp and the Trump camp, in terms of the odds here, because obviously during the debate when former President Trump was asked, do you want Ukraine to win the war? He just said he wanted it to be over. What does the sort of narrative do in terms of how the US is viewed and how voters are viewing foreign policy and the approach in Ukraine?
Well, Trump's narrative wasn't just he wanted the war to end, it was he wouldn't say he wanted Ukraine to win. And if you don't want Ukraine to win, you must not really understand the alliance system, the way the international body works, the international rules-based system. You must be totally giving up on that, because if Ukraine doesn't win, it's a significant blow against that international rules-based system, which we set up and is, as the Chinese would be first to tell you, very much in the benefit of the United States. So I think, for President Trump, he has a problem here because he doesn't want to offend Putin. He has been basically echoing, and so has J.D. Vance, Russian talking points. When you're talking about, there's going to be World War III and so forth, that's Mr. Putin's talking point. That's what he's using to try to intimidate the West from giving Ukraine what it needs to win. So I think we need to see through that, and I think that Harris campaign is doing the right thing. They say they're steady on course. That's what Vice President Harris said in the campaign, and I think if and when she's elected, she'll do a reconsideration of the policy and probably do more for Ukraine, because that's what's required.
General Clark, I want to ask you about energy. You do some work with the energy industry these days, and you mentioned before concerns about what might happen with Iran and effect on energy prices globally. Fossil fuel production under the Biden administration has been at record highs, not because of anything the Biden administration has done. That's just been the market. Does the U.S. energy industry need something from the government, or does it just need to continue on the course it's on?
I think the energy industry is doing extremely well. Maybe there's a little bit more that could be done in terms of leasing oil lands. But if you look at hydrocarbon production, it's up. Now, I'd like to see us take our natural gas supplies and use those to help nations around the world who are still burning coal. I'd like to see us take our LNG, go over there and help them get to a cleaner fuel while we're waiting on batteries and solar and other things that would give substitute base load. For the near term, 30 years or so, I don't see us giving up on hydrocarbons. And that means we need to invest in it, we need to support it, and we need to maximize, for U.S. national security and economic welfare purposes, we need to maximize our production of natural gas and use it to help those nations that don't have it.
General, we're low on time, but I wanted to get real quickly a little more energy in terms of the campaign. I'm curious kind of what your conversations are like with folks in the energy sector about the campaign these days. My ears perked up at the debate last week when Kamala Harris was talking about diverse sources of energy. Is that something that breaks through? Is that sort of change minds within the sector itself?
I think we're going to see small nuclear reactors come back. There's going to be more interest in nuclear. Obviously, if we could do something with fusion, that would be wonderful. It's still probably a couple of decades away. We're relying on hydrocarbons. We're putting more solar in, more wind in. Batteries are getting more capable, so some of that renewable can be base load. But I think the energy industry should be very happy with the policy, the all of the above policy, which is essentially what Kamala Harris is espousing. I think as she said, she's not against fracking. We've got to have fracking at least for the next few years because we need those resources.
General Wesley Clark, thank you so much for joining us on Capital Gains and for taking the time. We'll be sure to catch up with you, of course, as this continues to unfold.
Thank you, General Clark.
Thank you very much.
Now joining us after a busy week is Yahoo correspondent Andrew Romano to get us a pulse of what's been happening with the polling action over the last week. Andrew, talk about some of the polls that you're watching and perhaps if you've seen any movement in the days that have followed the debate.
Well, the big one for us is the Yahoo News YouGov poll, which we went into the field with right after the debate, and we actually did see big movement. We don't always see big movement. Generally, we've been showing a tied race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. The biggest advantage she had previously was 1 percentage point. In our poll, in the head-to-head, she has a 5-point advantage now, 50% to 45%. That's a big shift from before. So that's big news. We're seeing it's pretty consistent across other polls, actually. Polls that were out after the debate, national polls have showed her with a 3, 4, even 5-point advantage. So she has the momentum there. The swing states, a little bit more of a mixed picture, though there have been some in the last 24 hours showing her ahead in Pennsylvania, which is the key tipping point state for either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. She's up, I believe, 4 percentage points in the new New York Times Siena College poll. So that's big news. I think the basic story is it was a good debate for Kamala Harris. She has more momentum than Trump right now, but if you look at the modeling, the forecasting, it's still too close to call. This one's really going to go down to the wire.
Hey, Andrew, one of the bits of conventional wisdom about polling, since the polls were sort of wrong in 2016 and 2020, and they underestimated Donald Trump's support. So he overperformed in the election both years by somewhere between 2 and 4 percentage points. So in other words, give him an extra 2, 3, or 4 points to know where he really stands. Do you feel like that applies in 2024, or has the polling been corrected, or whatever accounted for that bias, is it gone?
Yeah, pollsters have worked on this. So part of the problem in the past was what they call response bias or non-response bias. That's with Democrats being more likely to respond to the polls than Republicans. This was a thing during COVID especially. And they have various methods to try to correct for that. But until we have election results, nobody knows. I actually think the bigger issue, and there could be an error, but it could be one way or the other. We've seen it go both ways, Democrats, Republicans in the past. So we just don't know. The bigger thing actually is that Republicans, Donald Trump has an advantage in the Electoral College, right? So if Kamala Harris has a 4 or 5 percentage point and then lead in the national polls, Trump can kind of claw that back because the Electoral College is favorable to him. And so when you see a lead for her nationally, deduct a couple of points there because the Electoral College balances that out.
One other strain of the polling this week, Andrew, that is interesting is the economic polls. We had another Financial Times poll. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago. There was a Morning Consult poll on the economy that shows a sort of pretty close contest. I guess I'm curious kind of what your thoughts are on those polls, but also on these economic polls overall. What does that tell us about the kind of dynamics of the overall race?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, voters always tell us that the economy is their most important issue. We actually, the way we phrase it in our poll is cost of living, because I think that's where most people's heads are at right now. 40% say that's the most important issue. Nothing else is even close. And previously, under Biden, when he was the presumptive nominee, Donald Trump had a 13 percentage point advantage on that metric. Now, as you said, in the Morning Consult poll, Financial Times poll, even our poll, we're only showing a 2-point gap there. They're basically tied, Trump and Harris on this, and that's big news for Harris because in general, people have seen Republicans and specifically Trump as economy focused. He's a good businessman. They're the party of business, and so they tend to give Republicans an edge on that. So I think it's an indication that Harris has separated herself from Biden somewhat on this issue. This is a terrible issue for Biden, obviously. And she's put out, a few policies that are pretty popular with voters. That Morning Consult poll looked at this. They went through and asked undecided voters about Trump and Harris's policies on the economy without identifying who they belong to. And Harris's were much more popular than Trump's. More presidential power over the Fed, that's unpopular with people. Increasing tariffs, it's kind of 50-50, but things like capping prices for prescription drugs and rent control, raising the minimum wage, child tax credits, things like that had large positive numbers. And I think some of that is breaking through for Harris.
Interesting to hear there about that Fed influence, especially given the rate cut that we got from the Fed this week. Appreciate you getting us up to speed there, Andrew Romano. And of course, a big thank you to General Clark and of course to my co-stars, Ben and Rick as well. That does it for this episode of Capital Gains. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.